Jeremiah Cole sat in the back of his Rolls-Royce, his fingers tapping lightly on the leather armrest. The tinted windows obscured his view of the outside world, a world where doors opened before he could knock, where people listened before he had to speak. But today, he was not Jeremiah Cole, billionaire philanthropist, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and fancy events. Today, he had no chauffeur, his loyal man named Leo, who eyed him uncertainly in the rearview mirror. "Are you sure, sir?" Leo asked, his voice laced with concern. Jeremiah adjusted the old hoodie he had pulled on, the fabric rough and faded and smelling of a thrift store. "I need to see it for myself," he said, stuffing a cheap prepaid phone into his pocket. "Just give me 2 hours." Leo hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be close." Jeremiah stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting him immediately. Along with the change in attire, so did his status. No longer the tailored suit or the shiny shoes, no longer the hidden signs of wealth, Jeremiah became invisible to those around him. He pulled his hood down lower, heading toward Central Park. It was clean, tidy. There were parents pushing expensive strollers, joggers in neon tracksuits, and an elderly couple feeding ducks near the pond. Jeremiah walked to an old bench near the trees, sat down, and waited. At first, nothing happened. A few people passed by, glanced at him briefly, then looked away immediately. But then, a man in a business suit approached from the right. The man paused, squinting at Jeremiah. "What are you doing here?" His voice was sharp. Jeremiah looked up, not answering right away. The man frowned, glanced at his shabby clothes, his worn shoes, and grimaced. "This is no place for homeless people. Go away." Jeremiah felt anger boiling in his chest, but he kept his cool. "I'm just sitting here." "The police won't think so," the man smirked, pulling out his phone. "I'll call them right away." Jeremiah sighed. Before he could say anything, he heard police sirens. 2 officers stepped forward, one of them placing his hand on his gun belt, looking at Jeremiah as if he were a dangerous criminal. "We've received a report of a homeless person causing a disturbance," one of the officers said, his voice cold. "Do you have identification?" Jeremiah slowly pulled out his wallet, opening it in front of them. Their eyes slid to the name on the ID card, Jeremiah Cole. And then, everything changed. The man in the suit paled, took a step back. The 2 officers looked at each other, confused. "I'm not causing trouble," Jeremiah said, his voice low but powerful. "But I just experienced what thousands of homeless people do every day." He turned to the man who had called the police. "You took one look at me and immediately concluded that I was dangerous. Why?" No one said anything. No one dared to answer. Jeremiah stood up, brushing his clothes. "This isn't my problem," he continued, his eyes sharp. "But I promise you, I'll do something about it." He left, leaving a heavy silence behind. The man in the suit bowed his head, the 2 officers stood still, unsure of what to say. Jeremiah walked out of the park, the Rolls-Royce parked nearby. Leo opened the car door, his eyes full of understanding. "I've seen enough now," Jeremiah said, his voice a mix of anger and determination. "We have work to do." His eyes narrowed as he took in Jeremiah's hunched posture. His gaze swept over the man's ragged, frayed clothes, the stains, the frayed seams. For a brief moment, it seemed as if he might say something, a word, a sentence, but then he pursed his lips, pulled out his phone, and turned down another street. A woman in tight yoga leggings and a designer jacket passed Jeremiah with a small cart. Her hands tightened on the handles as she sped up, her strides lengthening as she tried to get out of his way. A light breeze blew by, carrying the sound of hurried footsteps and wheels rolling on gravel. Jeremiah sighed, leaning back against the cool bench. He was undisturbed, no shouts or scornful looks. But the silence of avoidance, was too loud. It surrounded him, like an invisible wall between him and the rest of the world. He had a label, a brief definition, and no one bothered to know his name. Across the wide expanse of the park, a patrol car approached silently. Its tires rolled slowly over the pavement, making a dull sound. Jeremiah watched, the moment stretching into slow motion. The engine roared, and the car stopped. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, powerfully built like a former football player. His mustache was neatly trimmed, his face cold and unreadable. Sergeant Mark Ellison. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't rush forward or reach for his radio. He just stood there, looking at Jeremiah, maintaining a relaxed but authoritative stance. His expression was neutral, but Jeremiah could feel the weight of his gaze, the scrutiny, the assessment, or maybe something else, too vague to name. It seemed like an eternity before Ellison began to walk forward. His boots clicked on the cobblestones, slow and deliberate. Each step had its own weight, as if each one was a decision, a consideration. Jeremiah rested his calloused hands on his thighs, holding his position. His face was unreadable, a skill honed over years in ornate boardrooms where billion-dollar deals were negotiated with men who measured power by the thickness of their wallets. But here, on this worn wooden chair, power was no longer about money. It was about perception. Ellison finally spoke. His voice was low and flat. "Have you been here long?" Jeremiah tilted his head slightly, slowly meeting the officer's eyes. He let his voice take on a husky quality, a sound of time, of days slipping away. Long enough to know where questions like this usually lead. Jeremiah sat on the old wooden bench, one hand in the pocket of his hoodie, the other loosely on his knees. He tilted his head back, eyes closed as if weighed down by a non-existent fatigue. His breathing was even, showing no signs of exhaustion, but his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world was pulling him down to the ground. Ellison's eyes scanned him. Faded jeans, old hoodie, scuffed sneakers. Things that didn't really tell a story, but made you want to write one in your head. He'd bought the shoes that morning at a thrift store, but that detail made no difference to Ellison. The officer's expression didn't change, but his stance stiffened, more alert. Jeremiah felt the gaze, felt the way the space around them seemed to shrink. "Just passing through." Jeremiah shrugged, his voice even, not challenging but not submissive either. Ellison didn't like that answer. His fingers twitched near his belt, not on his weapon but close enough to send a clear message. "This is a family park." Ellison's voice was tense. "We've had complaints about gatherings." Jeremiah's mouth twitched. Gathering. A simple word, but enough to turn the silence into suspicion. Not sitting. Not resting. Gathering. "Is anyone complaining about me?" Jeremiah tilted his head. Ellison didn't answer right away. The radio on his shoulder crackled to a low hum, and he reached for it, mumbling something Jeremiah couldn't make out. A request for assistance? Or simply a notice that he was busy? The atmosphere changed. The joggers from earlier suddenly took a different route. The old couple by the water disappeared. Even the stroller-pushing mother turned away, pretending to focus on her phone. No one was watching, but everyone knew. Ellison exhaled through his nose, taking a step closer. "I don't know about your situation, but if you need a place to go, there's a shelter about 2 miles west of here." Jeremiah almost laughed. 2 miles west. He owned a high-rise 3 blocks away. But he didn't say that. Instead, he looked Ellison straight in the eye and asked, "Am I breaking any laws?" Ellison didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened for a second. Just a second. But it was enough. Hesitation. Discomfort. "If you have no business here, I suggest you move," Ellison said, his voice less firm than before, but still a command. Jeremiah took a breath, not too fast, not too slow. His eyes scanned the park, the furtive glances, the retreating footsteps. He wondered if any of them really thought he was tired, or if he was just pretending to believe it. He stood up, took his hands out of his pockets, and left. Not because Ellison had ordered him to, but because the game was over. The unwritten rule was that people liked him. Or at least the version of him they thought shouldn't be in places like this. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, deliberately slowing down, letting the seconds pass. He waited. If I don't. Ellison shifted his weight, and Jeremiah knew, we had a problem. But he also knew that the real problem wasn't him. It was how the world decided who belonged where. The air between them was like a taut rubber band, vibrating with anticipation. Just the slightest tug, and it would snap. Jeremiah had dealt with tough negotiators, ruthless investors, media predators looking for the slightest opening. But this was different. Sergeant Ellison didn't see a man who had built an empire from scratch. He saw a problem to be eliminated. Ellison straightened his shoulders. Sir, I'll ask you one more time. Do you have a reason to be here? Jeremiah let the silence sink in. He could hear the hum of traffic in the distance, the chirping of birds in the trees. But underneath it all, there was something sharper, a sense of anticipation. The awareness of people watching, not daring to look directly. Why did it matter? Jeremiah asked finally, his voice calm, steady. Ellison's jaw twitched. Because I enforce city ordinances. And if someone is loitering in public with no apparent purpose, I have the right to question them. Jeremiah tilted his head a little. And if I'm sitting here in a suit? Ellison hesitated for just a second, but Jeremiah caught it. A moment of hesitation. A crack in the hard mask. This has nothing to do with. It has to do with it. Jeremiah interrupted, his voice hardening. You see me sitting here. I'm not asking for money. I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just existing. But you came anyway. Why? Ellison's eyes darkened. Because I do my job. Or because I look like someone you don't think belongs here. The question hung between them, thick and suffocating. Ellison exhaled sharply through his nose. I don't have time for games. But Jeremiah knew, this had never been a game. This was a reality he had grown accustomed to. He waited for an answer, knowing it might never come. Jeremiah felt his pulse slow there. It was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment when annoyance turned to power, curiosity to strength. Across the street, a couple walked by, glancing with a mix of concern and indifference. Not concerned enough to intervene, but enough to watch. He shifted on the bench, elbows resting on his knees. So let me get this straight. A man sitting alone in a park, bothering no one, is now a police problem. Ellison didn't blink. I don't make the rules. No, but you choose when to enforce them. A moment of hesitation. This time, Ellison covered it quickly. He reached for his radio and pressed a button. I have an individual in the park, refusing to cooperate. Additional units will be needed. Jeremiah almost smiled. Refuse to cooperate, a phrase designed to dehumanize, to turn a person into an incident. The escalation happened exactly as he had predicted. But what he hadn't anticipated was how far it would go. Inside his mind was racing, weighing the possibilities. As the call went out, power shifted. Before, Ellison had been just an officer performing his duties. Now, he was preparing to deal with a potential threat. Ellison shifted his stance, his weight more evenly distributed, more ready. A woman walking her dog stopped a few feet away, pretending to adjust her leash. A jogger pulled out his phone, holding it low but angled enough to record. The attention was growing. But no one stepped forward. Jeremiah sighed. He had two choices: stand up, comply, and let this encounter become one of thousands of silent injustices. Or stand firm, forcing them to reveal their true colors. He chose the latter. "I'm not breaking any laws," he said, his voice calm. Ellison tilted his head, as if considering something. But before he could reply, a voice came over the radio. "Unit is coming. Hold your position." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Jeremiah could feel every eye on him. His hands were on his lap, trying to keep his composure. He didn't run. He didn't make any sudden movements. But he didn't back down either. Red and green lights flashed in the distance. The air seemed to shrink, waiting for the next explosion. Jeremiah swallowed. In this moment, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all the time someone had been forced to back down, to keep their heads down. "So what do we do next, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice steadier than his heartbeat. Jeremiah sat still, his back straight, his eyes darting between the two officers. He didn't seem defiant, but he didn't seem inclined to back down either. His hand still held the small radio, a relic of his past that he carried with him at all times. "You need to move." Officer Ellison's voice was firm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. The way Jeremiah looked at him made him feel like he was being judged, analyzed, like he had seen too many of him before. "That's not the law," Jeremiah replied, his voice calm but no less certain. A brief silence fell between them. Behind them, a small crowd gathered. Some were listening, others were secretly recording on their phones. Ellison took a breath, trying to take control of the situation. "I'm giving you a legal order. You can comply, or we can take the next step." Jeremiah tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. He saw not anger in the officer's eyes but uncertainty, as if Ellison wasn't quite sure what he was doing. "And what exactly is the next step?" Jeremiah asked, his voice unchanged, only his eyes sharpening. Ellison didn't answer right away. He just stared, a threatening stare, a tactic for unsettling an opponent. But Jeremiah had spent years in boardrooms where power was the only language that mattered. He knew this game, and he knew how to play it. A siren sounded in the distance, and another patrol car pulled up. A younger officer stepped out, Danvers. He was shorter than Ellison, younger, but there was determination in his stride. "What's going on?" Danvers asked as he approached. Ellison didn't take his eyes off Jeremiah. "This individual refuses to leave after being instructed." Danvers glanced at Jeremiah, assessing quickly. "He's trespassing." Ellison took a sharp breath. "No, but nothing." Jeremiah interrupted. His voice rang out clearly, cutting through the tension. "I'm sitting in a public park. It's not illegal." Danvers pursed his lips, turning to Ellison. "So why are we here?" Ellison didn't answer right away. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. For the first time since the confrontation began, Jeremiah saw suspicion creep into the officer's eyes. But the tension hung in the air, waiting to explode. Then Ellison reached for the handcuffs. "Stand up," he commanded. The atmosphere changed instantly. A commotion spread through the crowd. Some began to whisper. A man sitting on a nearby bench slowly rose, as if considering whether to intervene. A jogger raised his phone higher, recording each detail more clearly. Jeremiah didn't move. On what grounds? Ellison clenched his jaw. Interference. A moment of silence fell. No one spoke. No one moved. Just the distant noise of the city and the murmurs of onlookers. Jeremiah looked straight at Ellison. "Do you really want to do this?" Ellison hesitated. But what happened next would change everything. Ellison stood firm, the cold handcuffs dangling in his hands, his eyes never leaving Jeremiah. The crowd around him grew larger, their breathing synchronizing with the tension of the moment. Danvers shifted slightly, his anxious gaze sweeping over his partner and stopping at Jeremiah, who remained seated, his expression calm but not at all vulnerable. Jeremiah took a deep breath and slowly stood. There was no sign of fear, no hesitation. He just waited. Ellison tightened his grip on the handcuffs, ready to order Jeremiah to turn around and restrain him. But before the officer could reach out, Jeremiah spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. "I need you to think carefully about what you're doing, Sergeant." His words cut through the air like a sharp blade. Ellison didn't blink, but his jaw clenched. "I'm not taking orders from you," the officer replied, his voice dry. "You're about to handcuff a man, for sitting on a bench," Jeremiah continued, his tone unchanged. "A man who has never broken any laws. A man who donated $200,000 to the police department's community outreach program last week." There was a long pause. Danvers frowned, his eyes filled with doubt. "What?" Jeremiah reached into the pocket of his hoodie, moving slowly, deliberately. He pulled out his phone, unlocked it with a few taps, and flipped the screen toward them. The light from the screen reflected off Ellison's rigid face, illuminating the headline. "Billionaire philanthropist Jeremiah Cole donates $200,000 to local law enforcement initiatives." Ellison's entire expression wavered for the first time. Danvers leaned over to look at the headline, then turned to Jeremiah, this time with something other than doubt in his eyes. It was recognition. Jeremiah nodded slowly. "Yes, that's me." Ellison took a half-step back. His mouth opened, as if searching for words, but nothing came out. The crowd grew larger, each eye focused on the scene before them. The story was out of their control. Jeremiah looked Ellison straight in the eye, this time his voice sharper. "You think I'm homeless, right?" Ellison's face flushed, a mixture of shame and anger. Jeremiah could see it, feel it like a rising tide. But he didn't back down. Danvers cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Cole." Jeremiah raised his hand, stopping him. "Don't." His voice was low, steady. "Don't." Ellison blinked, breathing heavily. He had thought he had this situation under control. That he could force Jeremiah to submit, as he had done so many times with those he considered beneath him. But not this time. "Now you know my name," Jeremiah said, his voice devoid of any trace of trepidation. "No fear." Ellison looked lost and trapped. He realized this was beyond the script he was familiar with. There were no memorized lines, no routines he could rely on. There was only one stark truth left: he was facing a public reckoning that he had no control over. But Jeremiah wasn't finished yet. Ellison swallowed, loosening his grip on the handcuffs. The shift in power was undeniable. The man he had tried to dismiss was no longer an anonymous figure in society. He was someone who could change the narrative, with a single word. Jeremiah didn't move. He let the silence fall, letting the weight of the moment weigh not just on Ellison but on everyone watching. The phones were still rolling. The eyes were still watching. Waiting. Danvers cleared his throat again, his voice softer this time, calmer. A feeble attempt to ease the tension. "Mr. Cole, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Jeremiah chuckled. A laugh that carried not joy, but deep recognition. "A misunderstanding?" He shook his head. "No, there's no misunderstanding. You understand me perfectly." His eyes locked on Ellison. "When you saw me sitting here, you saw what you wanted to see." Ellison took a sharp breath, his eyes flicking to the cameraman. He wasn't just losing control. He was losing the right to define this story. Jeremiah took a step forward, forcing him to look him in the eye. "If I was wearing a suit, would you ask me?" Ellison said nothing. "If I was a white man, sitting here in these clothes, would you call me back?" Ellison's jaw tightened, but he had no answer. Jeremiah nodded, slowly. "Exactly." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Meaningful glances were exchanged, and a few shifted, uncomfortable with the tension in the air. The truth was out there now, naked, unmasked, and no one could ignore it. Danvers tried to regain his composure, his gaze scanning the crowd, but found no agreement. He swallowed. "We don't want any trouble," Danvers said, his voice now lacking its usual firmness. "You're free to go." Jeremiah sighed, shaking his head, his eyes reflecting deep disappointment. "That's the problem. I've always been free to go. But not because you wanted me to. You just wanted me gone." Ellison stood still, his face unreadable now. A storm of emotions flashed in his eyes, anger, shame, perhaps regret. But it was too late to turn back. Jeremiah glanced at the crowd again. People were paying attention, in a way they had never done before. He looked directly at Ellison one last time. "You had a chance to do better," his voice was low but clear. "You didn't choose it." Without another word, Jeremiah turned and walked away. The crowd parted, making way for him. The whispers continued, the phones still recording every moment. Ellison and Danvers stood there, stripped of not only power, but honor. Only their uniforms and regret remained. But Jeremiah knew, this wasn't over. He left the park, but the weight of what had just happened still weighed heavily on his shoulders. The people around him, the questioning eyes, the silent judgments. The way power had almost crushed him, simply because he existed in the wrong clothes. This didn't surprise him. And that was the real problem. It should have surprised him. It should have been unacceptable. Jeremiah pulled out his phone, his fingers scrolling through the pile of unread messages from Leo. He knew his driver had seen it all. Probably was itching to intervene. But this was bigger than him, bigger than a single confrontation. His hand hovered over the screen for a moment, then he began typing. A simple post. A short video. A bare truth. Within minutes, it had gone viral. No fanfare. No exaggeration. Just the truth. I conducted a social experiment today. I sat on a bench in a public park. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't cause any chaos. I just sat there. And within minutes, I was confronted by law enforcement. Treated like a criminal. Threatened with arrest. Because I didn't look like I belonged. The only thing that changed their approach. My name. He pressed the publish button. By the time he reached his penthouse, his phone was ringing. The comments were filled with outrage and horror. The deal was rejected. Some demanded an explanation. Others defended the officers. But the truth was out, and the conversation was on. Leo met him at the door, arms crossed. Are you okay? Jeremiah sighed. I'm fine. Leo shook his head. They don't know who they're messing with. Jeremiah just smiled tiredly. That's the point, Leo. It shouldn't matter who I am. Leo didn't argue. He just nodded because he knew Jeremiah was right. The next morning, his name was everywhere. News outlets picked up the story. Online debates raged, some defending the officers, others tearing them down. But the bigger question, louder than any excuses offered. Why does respect only come with wealth and status? The police department issued a statement. A weak defense. But Jeremiah wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted to change. He knew the video wouldn't fix everything, but if it made one person stop and think before making an assumption, it was worth it. Because next time, the person sitting on that couch might not be a billionaire. And they might not walk away. If this story makes you think, don't just sit there with it. Share it. Start a conversation. Challenge the way we see people. Because change starts with awareness.